her PhD in English at the University of Hawaiʻi at Mānoa, and she's a mental health advocate, writer, and researcher. Her community work aims to encourage self-empowerment through centering and amplifying persons marginalized and disadvantaged, and she's the author of 3 life writing books. The creative biography Searching for Li was shortlisted for the Singapore Literature Prize 2024, a finalist for Best Nonfiction Title at the Singapore Book Awards in 2023, and cited by the Straits Times as one of 7 books to look forward to in 2022. Her memoir, A Philosopher's Madness, an account of fortitude and resilience, has been translated into Chinese and distributed in mental health services in Hong Kong. Li Shan currently serves as a commissioner of the Lancet Psychiatry Lived Experience Commission, and her presentation today is entitled Lived Experience in Mental Health. She will be examining how life writing, autobiographies, memoirs, and biographies can build solidarity among persons with lived experience of mental health issues in Singapore, and how acts of sharing personal experiences and stories can perhaps ultimately re-politicize Singapore's mental health landscape. And responding to Li Shan's presentation, we have Dr. Diana Rose, who is an honorary distinguished professor at the Australian National University. She has also served as a professor of user-led research and as director of the Service User Research Enterprise at King's College London. She has been associated with multiple research programs at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology, and Neuroscience, and she was a founding editor of the radical psychology journal Ideology and Consciousness. Thank you, Diana, for taking the time to read and respond to Li Shan's paper. So just to give you a little bit of a rundown of what will happen, our session will last for approximately an hour. Li Shan will be speaking for about 25 to 30 minutes, and Diana will respond for 5 minutes before we open it up for a more general discussion. Please feel free at the end of Li Shan's talk and Diana's remarks to place your comments or questions in the chat box, and I will read them aloud. And now, without further ado, I will turn it over to Li Shan.
Hello. First of all, thank you to the organizing team at academia.sg, Professor Diana Rose, Associate Professor Joanne Liao, and everyone here today attending this session. So I'll just begin. To my fellow peers, persons with lived experience, Xiao Ting Tong, Orang Gila, I am speaking today to reach out to those of us for whom fatigue is ever present. The body fails, even if the mind is willing. The exhaustion has become normal after a decade or so. Superlative consumption of caffeine destroys the brain, I am told. I recently started on electrolyte drinks that promise fatigue reduction. How else can it be possible to get round to basic hygiene like showering, let alone completing administrative tasks, reading widely and thinking deeply, and quote unquote, living a normal life? Our bodies have lived with decades of just being tired. Some of us are working from our beds. Some of us are writing what we can on our mobile phones because getting to the computer is sometimes too hard. It may not be helpful to force oneself to work regular office hours or expect fellow persons with lived experience to do so. It becomes important to accomplish more in the limited hours we have. Advancements in medication withdrawal strategies have not yet been developed for persons diagnosed with severe mental illnesses such as schizophrenia. Still, we go on. I am writing during the day with several lights switched on next to me to help regulate my alertness and mood. I hope my sharing speaks to those who need it, to comfort and further to gather and galvanize us to talk to each other. In a society where worth is defined by one's employment, it may feel that there is a need to constantly explain to others why finding and sustaining work can be so hard. Where the environment is trained on healthy lifestyles and fitness, some of us live with feelings of shame when one's body is out of control because of weight gain caused by medications. Some of us are experiencing Parkinsonian-like symptoms due to the long-term effects of psychiatric medications. Individual willpower and resilience may not be enough to overcome our difficulties, but holding space and being there for each other through organized caring is not always easy either. We do what we can to care for each other, and sometimes it doesn't work out. We may have failed, but as Kuo Pao Kun famously said, a worthy failure is better than a mediocre success. There are 3 points I want to make in this talk. The first is, solidarity is hard. If there's a time to be blunt, this is it. Being blunt and hurting feelings can sometimes be preferable to being nice and indirectly harming others by not getting involved. The choice between staying assimilated and challenging the status quo is not neutral. To assimilate is to become absorbed into a culture. I had not been intentionally silenced by mental health professionals. To the contrary, I had been asked to step up, to speak out, and to share my thoughts and experiences, albeit only thoughts and experiences that wouldn't threaten the status quo and that would reinforce the medicalization of society. I had been thoroughly assimilated into the mental health system through my mental health advocacy and the various jobs I held at mental health agencies. But I had not yet begun to see that clearly. I was thinking in terms of compliance and non-compliance. I was thinking in terms of using stories for effective services planning and delivery. Assimilation may be about power and knowledge, but above all, it is about language. Powers that be can acknowledge the power differential between providers and patients and seek to address this by listening more to patients. But the word patient itself locks in a sense of diminished power. To what degree can a patient, especially one in the throes of psychosis, be responsible for anything, let alone decision-making? I wish it were easier, but it isn't. If psychiatry is not neutral, but political, then for persons of psychiatric histories to find our power, we must strive to unlearn the language of mental illness and psychiatry and learn a new language that eradicates what may seem to be neutral words: symptoms, remission, mental capacity, insight, and compliance, to name a few. Some have argued that co-production can be a quote-unquote third space that rises above the difficulties of provider or patient perspectives by integrating them. In co-production processes, provider and patient work together as opposed to hitting against each other. The devil is in the details, however, and the question arises as to whose perspectives are being integrated into whose. If patients have to learn the language of mental illness and psychiatry, then we have fallen again into assimilation, and it doesn't seem like genuine co-production or co-creation. It is only when we find a way to speak of our experiences in our own words that we can find our self-respect. It is not that I am advocating for infighting amongst us, but I do think there can be mutual accountability and shared values. We are not isolated and alone, even if it feels that way. We can be allowed to have a community, diverse but constructive in our differences. We can be allowed to have a history of those who have come before us, who have experienced what we may think we are experiencing alone. We can be allowed to educate ourselves in global movements and use what might be relevant for our purposes. Lived experience leadership in Singapore has been equated with being invited to the table to sit with mental health professionals. But being invited to sit at the table of the mainstream mental health establishment is one thing. Being able to create our own table is another. If one has been invited to sit at the table, I think you must understand and acknowledge your privilege, and further, acknowledge that you don't speak for everyone. Using one's privilege therefore means advocating for more persons with lived experience, with a diverse range of views at the table, as well as fair and equitable compensation for persons with lived experience. Those at the table should not be seen as representing us when their position is not to rock the boat in order to protect their self-interest. My fellow peers who choose to do so may have their reasons. As a long-standing peer-run organization shared with me, it is sometimes the more moderate position that permits survival. Giving off the appearance of assimilation and performing cooperation is then a necessary tactic to encourage more invitations to speak media engagements to promote one's organization, and even to find possible funding opportunities. Such pragmatic justification may seem harmless and legitimate, but it is not. There is, quote-unquote, survival of promoting oneself as a mental health advocate and one's organization with a mission to support persons with lived experience in a neoliberal environment. And there is the reality of survival that has as its basis community and collective support. I felt this energy strongly when a friend and fellow person with lived experience, who is Malay and Muslim, cooked a meal of teochew moi that we shared and ate together. Masak bersama, makan bersama. For those who choose to sit at the table but not to challenge the status quo are saying okay to the way things are. For example, coercive practices effecting violence on the minds and bodies of our fellow peers under involuntary admission and treatment. We may think we have an advanced mental health care system, but we still rely on quote-unquote last resort coercive practices such as restraints. This can lead to devastating consequences. A prominent example of an avoidable death from the UK was of a young Black man who lost his life from being restrained in 2010. His name was Shenny. This unfortunately is what sometimes passes for care in societies. So I think we need to start acting in ways that promote the dignity of persons diagnosed with mental illness, as opposed to effecting humiliation and fear-inducing narratives. By accepting assimilation, some advocates are taking it for granted that everyone has the option of recovering fully with the support of family, loved ones, and friends, and that everyone has convenient access to circles of community. These advocates may have forgotten the serious problem of biological family as a primary source of mental distress and harm. Those who choose to sit at the table with mental health professionals today are modeling what may look like a toppling of hierarchies in healthcare. Nevertheless, agreeing to subordinate all healing modalities and approaches to biomedical perspectives hardly challenges the status quo. Narrative therapy, for example, is a topic that has raised much interest and attention, but this seems to subsume storytelling squarely under the rubric of the clinical framework. The work of persons with lived experience need not include pursuing a strategy of direct therapeutic intervention. There is an alternative path which is less clearly visible, utilizing indirect approaches, understanding reading and writing as activities vital to transformation, growth, and healing. Already, there has been an incredible amount of work that many researchers and lived experience researchers elsewhere have done. In private conversations, fellow peers have quoted policymakers dismissing some such work as irrelevant because they are quote-unquote Western and therefore of no use to us. I cannot speak for policymakers, but it seems to me important for persons with lived experience to know a little bit about what is going on in other countries, and at the very least to know what those programs and arguments are before declaring them unworthy of our consideration. Given these real-life problems, can there really be solidarity and kinship amongst us? What if, despite our good intentions, we find everything that we hoped would not be there? Politics, talking behind each other, talking behind closed doors, avoiding specific names so as not to be tainted by association. Then what? Point number 2, but we can read, or we can write, or we can speak, whichever works. So I want to ask, how might we see or look at madness and the mental health landscape with different eyes? Perhaps I am not looking at madness, but looking for madness. Perhaps mad eyes are needed to see ourselves and others more truly, ethically, and compassionately. A mad eye is not a moody eye, nor is it an angry eye, but a mad eye is likely an unreasonable eye, one that can see past obvious solutions and conclusions, and one that sees possibilities for our mental health future. A mad eye sees beyond appearances how difference can be pathologized and or conveniently avoided when it does not suit institutional agendas. Then this might be applied to a variety of situations that appear incommensurable. For example, abolitionist approaches to mental health legislation are not quote-unquote radical or quote-unquote unreasonable, but visionary in their own way, which means that reformist approaches need not be the only legitimate path forwards. So the question of whether to abolish laws or dismantle systems or reform them significantly, I think, is not easily resolved. And in the context of this presentation, there may be something a little bit mad about moving beyond the obvious issues of fighting stigma towards building a solidarity and kinship with people who have long died. This is Madland, a place where madness proudly resides. I refuse to forget my predecessors in mental health who came before me. As a person with lived experience, I wondered about how to better remember the lost voices of those who lived in the asylums in colonial Singapore. My predecessors are not related by blood, and yet I feel a kinship with them. So I tried to write something which has its basis in non-fiction sources. I wish to write a composite account of an unnamed man. So much has been said about the great doctors from past to present, but what about the patients? I wanted to break through walls to get to the other side, to overcome medical heroism and superiority by telling the stories of our predecessors, to honor them and send healing. In a WhatsApp chat group, my fellow peer, Johanna Abdullah, shared a quote that resonated with her. Quote, "Every time you speak your truth, it liberates your ancestors who had to stay silent." End quote. Though widely shared, I don't know who first said this, but the words moved me deeply because it reminded me of the erasure, silencing, neglect, or simple dismissal of the existence, import, or worth of our mental health predecessors by the asylum keepers, colonial officers, and psychiatrists, who in their medical records and files documented and then wrote the history of mental health. So my composite account would be made from descriptions of actual people, rickshaw coolies, and asylum inmates, in social histories, books and journal articles, and medical reports from the colonial archives. Notwithstanding the contentiousness of using composite accounts in nonfiction, because it seems to blur the boundaries between fact and fiction, I believe this is justified because of the loose traces that have been excavated that may never be otherwise put together. So this is about listening and going beyond the design and shape of the colonial archives, which has a tendency to emphasize colonial figures, practices, and beliefs. It's about feeling for the traces and finding the fragments, and making room for these to be amplified, decentering the center and centering the margins. Extracting some parts from my account, an unnamed man worked as a rickshaw coolie in colonial Singapore around 1910. He was 32 years old. He had made his way to the Nanyang because he had no chance of survival, let alone success, in his hometown village in China. Life was a series of humiliations, and there was too much poverty. His dream in coming to Singapore was to make something of himself and eventually to return home to his grandmother, parents, and fiancé with the money to buy land. Only in this way could he hold his head up with a sense of pride at having made good. He came in a junk with other men from similar backgrounds. Some of them would find work in pepper and gambia plantations, while others would be tasked the unenviable work of moving large sacks of rice and other goods on their backs from ship to land. This unnamed man would find work as a rickshaw puller. He was lucky to have found work at all. But the work was tough, and he often felt breathless from physical exertion, and the bodily aches and pains from his work never quite went away, even after a night's rest. The aches would linger on for weeks, sometimes months. In the absence of family to turn to for care and support, he made a habit of gambling on some nights and visiting brothels on a regular basis to quench his loneliness. He did not lose his savings in gambling, but one day he found a round, painless sore on his genitals. This was followed by rashes on his palms and the soles of his feet. The rashes on his feet made it difficult to comfortably walk, and the rashes on his palms made it nasty and painful to hold on to the poles of his rickshaw. When a policeman eventually found him, he was muttering repeatedly to himself. Since he was not identifiable and had no next of kin, he was placed in the mental asylum for wandering lunatics. My predecessor was subjected to native-specific treatment. The European lunatics were fed milk, butter, chicken, mutton, and potatoes, as well as staples such as bread, tea, and sugar. The natives were on a diet of rice and other foods. But many of his fellow inmates would be diagnosed with beriberi, a disease thought to be caused by rice. The medical superintendent conducted scientific experiments, likely without their consent. The physical bodies and mental states of this man and his fellow inmates that were studied and observed by colonial administrators such as Hugh Clifford and Frank Swettenham fed into medical perceptions of specific races as prone to particular types of mental conditions. Natives were thought to be prone to amok and lata. This shaped the development of psychiatry and notions of culture-bound syndromes. In this way, knowledges of bodies were utilized to build and develop bodies of knowledge in the motherland. Importantly, credit was attributed to the colonial officers, but not the experiment subjects. For example, the contributions of medical superintendent, Dr. William Gilmore Ellis, have been noted, but acknowledgement has not been given to the many asylum inmates who contributed their bodies to our knowing more about beriberi. Other than being an object of diagnosis, treatment, and research, the unnamed man, together with other native lunatics, was encouraged to work for no compensation. They were sometimes rewarded with addictive substances such as tobacco and betel nut. The ability to work was likely a condition for release and thought to evidence a patient's improvement. Since he was uncooperative, he was generally perceived to be uncured. When tasked to weave baskets, an activity that directly supported the income and thus the running of the asylum, he would start shouting, which disturbed the other inmates, preventing them from completing their work. He was therefore categorized as quote, unquote, excitable. Point number 3, we can connect the past with the present. So my unnamed predecessor failed to perform recovery. He was not a good patient. Then and now, good patients who strive to recover, seek gainful employment, and contribute to the economy are worthy of celebration. Chronically ill patients who fail to cope with their mental illness are undeserving, recalcitrant individuals. Good patient stories, therefore, foreground life changes, overcoming denial, employment and disclosure, medications and illness management, relationships with family and friends, existential issues, and perhaps most prominently, helpful strategies and tips for recovery. Quote, to be a good patient is to learn to play the game, to lie convincingly. Mental health activist Judy Chamberlain explained. And worst of all, to lie to ourselves until we no longer know what we believe. End quote. I too was once a quote unquote wandering lunatic of sorts, looking for a church because I wanted to become a nun. Although perhaps I was deluding myself, because the real reason was hoping to find a bed for the night. I was out of money, but I didn't think of sleeping in a tent on Changi Beach like many of the homeless do. I was tired of sleeping on thin mattresses and bathing together with the Thai and Vietnamese prostitutes at Bugis. The rooms were dark and hot and damp, the walls, plywood partitions to provide privacy. I would black out there for hours on end, roaches climbing around me. When awake, I would drink tea at a coffee shop downstairs. The air smelling of grease, the spoon sticky with condensed milk, with a collection of plays by Chekhov for company. Though I had done nothing wrong, I felt a profound sense of shame. Mental health research today may often include us as research subjects and lived experience as data points. Yet, while it is important to include lived experience perspectives, it can also be construed as exploitation, since many clinical mental health research studies do not seem to provide clear direct or indirect benefits to research subjects. This unhappy state of affairs needs to be understood within the history of research extraction from persons with lived experience. Indigenous persons are especially susceptible to this kind of extraction, and so are we. Born out of colonialism and extractive thinking, the academic enterprise and its institutions' historical legacy demands our attention. IRB approval may not always be sufficient to ensure truly ethical research. Earlier this year, I called into question a publication that analyzed data from a counseling program without informing the participants. Identifying details had been removed, but the researchers had stated in writing to their young clients that the sessions were confidential. That the researchers decided to use this data anyway and share it with an outside group seemed wrong to me, but when I wrote to the research lead to register my concern, the response indicated no sense that wrong might have been done to the clients. They simply replied that the research had obtained ethics approval and, quote, "I'm sorry you feel that way," end quote. Later, I noticed that some fine print was included on the website to indicate that data could be shared. Despite my belief that there are good people within the system, I have nevertheless sometimes encountered researchers using material clearly marked as confidential for subsequent research purposes. How much have things really changed from the past to the present? Who benefits from the research? In concluding, silence can be very loud, so let's listen. Diana Rose once wrote that she was, quote, "the author of my own erasure," end quote. I too wish to record that I erased myself in order to be understood by others. With the help of others, I became, quote, "the woman with schizophrenia," end quote, a box that I designed for myself through self-censorship and self-silencing. I held back from thinking thoughts and remembering experiences. I silenced myself to be heard. In Singapore, one of the most widely read books on schizophrenia is perhaps Danielle Lim's The Sound of SCH, published in 2014. The title raises a question as to what mental illness sounds like. As a person diagnosed with schizophrenia, my perspective on the sound of SCH is that what we hear is very often silence. But our continued silence only serves to protect those who have hurt us, persons with lived experience. Yet, by recognizing and acknowledging these silences, we are beginning to listen. I have been largely silent about my family's pain. I feel I'm ready now to understand as opposed to thrashing around in reactive mode. I see how my mother shifted into problem-solving mode and did not allow herself to feel. How reason interfered with deeply felt emotions because we are taught that this is irrelevant in a crisis. My sister's anger at me for not performing sanity and getting myself arrested and tied to a bed in hospital. My father's inherent confusion at his daughter, still so young, being diagnosed with a lifelong debilitating illness. My brother's sadness that his strong sister could actually be so weak. Through my mad eye, I see my family's confusion as to what to do next. My family's anger at themselves for not preventing such a thing from happening. My family's inability to forgive themselves, to forgive me, to forgive those in charge of my care. Their grief must have been overwhelming. How the university failed to inform them of things going awry. How the hospital failed to cure or fix me from mental illness through prescribing medication after medication. How a family became a wreck in the eyes of society. How a future was now devastated. How family should be the first line of support, but they were completely unequipped. It was only a small step away from thinking that recusing from helping might be the solution to the chaos. Of course, Mei Mei, little sister, was to be blamed, and she should not have allowed herself to become one of the crazy ones, but then That was perhaps inevitable. It is always the quiet ones, isn't it? I've likewise been silent on privilege. In my efforts to raise awareness about mental health, I had failed to acknowledge my privilege. My stories, lived experience, and speeches regarding mental health had been heard in committees, boards of mental health organizations, senior management meetings, conferences, public events, and media, newsprint, online articles, and TV. I was told that what I said had quote-unquote impact, that my story served to inspire and bring hope, healing, and insight. This gave me a false sense of individual achievement, but I want to use my privilege in the best way I can, both understanding and resisting how I have been conditioned to speak. I had a sobering conversation with a Malay friend. She told me that when she tried to decline psychiatric medications or to give feedback on her medical treatment to her providers, she received confused stares, followed by the suggestion that her quote-unquote anger was part of her mental health condition. Her responses were therefore not just invalidated and dismissed, but even pathologized. That my friend's critical feedback was unheard, disrespected, reinterpreted, or distorted by medical professionals was possibly aggravated by perceptions due to race, and because the hospital environment privileges science and rationality, any expressed emotions are considered to be needless in communication. As the philosopher Miranda Fricker explains, epistemic injustice results not from intentional acts by evil perpetrators. Instead, epistemic injustice emerges from treating persons from minority races with mental health issues as objects of diagnosis and treatment. It results not just from the hospital environment, but in Singapore, from our overwhelmingly Chinese majority society. We can do better. We must do better. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Li Shan, for a really powerful and moving presentation. I'm going to turn this over now to Dr. Diana Rose to give a response, and after which we'll open up the floor for general Q&A. Diana, thank you. I believe you're muted.
What happened?
We can hear you
Hello?
now.
You can hear me. I can't see
Yes.
me. I can't see me.
We can see you too.
Well, I can't see me. Never mind. What I said was good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much, Li Shan. I want to come at this from a slightly different angle, but I'll soon look back to what you said. And that my question is, when does psychiatry stop being psychiatry? There are plenty of alternative psychiatries, but what about an alternative that has no track with psychiatry at all? The kind of thing that Li Shan spoke about. It involved knowledge and discourse and materiality. I don't want to be a dualist. I want to argue that a humanities background specifically might lead us to an alternative narrative, but equally people with no formal academic training and the specific materiality of psychiatric drugs with which Li Shan opens her talk. So by alternative narrative, I mean a discourse and practice that would not be an alternative psychiatry or make that plural. Li Shan talks about having to learn and then unlearn clinical language. The fact is that most people round the table in involvement or engagement terms, they know that clinical language already, at least in the so-called global north. They are nurse educators, they are social workers in mental health, they are psychologists, or they are medical anthropologists, even medical humanities. With concept creep, it has become something that is spoken about every day, especially on social media. Especially peer workers, recovery workers, sign nurses, they do not have to learn like Li Shan did. is clinical language. It comes naturally. To unlearn it is like losing a part of your native tongue. One reason why I think involvement has had so little effect. To correct Fricke's hermeneutic injustice, a much understood term, you need a different register. A register being a way of speaking a language that is different from a good one is the diagnostic interview. The psychiatrist is speaking in one register in asking the questions. The answers are coming from a completely different one. But because the psychiatrist has the powerful register, a psychiatrist has the power to pathologize. Li Shan, I think, provides a different register. Now, I'm supposed to connect junior scholars here with the wider world, i.e. the Anglophone world. But I want to keep the term life writing. The closest approach in the West is something called autoethnography, with roots in anthropology. But it has been accused of subjectivity to the point of navel gazing, that is your belly button. And where was I? It should position the subject in structural as well as immediate context, but it rarely does. It rarely does. Oh, somebody put something in the chat. Classically, it is concerned with identity. I think that Li Shan's work is what autoethnography should be, but is not. Autoethnography does not do what Li Shan does. In addition, she takes on her own privilege and how she deals with it. Nobody does this. Nobody will admit that they're privileged in this space. Thirdly, she can write. I'm very critical of the concept of lived experience on grounds that it individualizes just like psychiatry does and depoliticizes. First-person accounts and focus groups are the beginning and the end. The papers are dry and ahistorical. Do they connect with their ancestors? No. As well as apolitical, because there is an obsession with publish or perish. Do you know that the only trial of olanzapine had an 8-week follow-up period, and it generated 80 papers, 80 from one trial. Once again, people are forced when they write papers to follow Psy. Now, you might have guessed I myself am not typical. I do have a degree in psychology, but it was not the same in 1971. My life when I've been in work, has been with various aspects of language use, including sign language, as I grew up fluent in a community of deaf children and adults. Everything from early sociolinguistics to semiotics and hermeneutics. In other words, I speak both languages, the language of Psy and the language of language. Now to turn to the material, who speaks? Who gets to speak on our behalf? People involved in such work in the West are overwhelmingly white and middle class. This is well known, and there's a lot of talk about diversity. Why don't we have more diversity? So why are they largely white and middle class? It's not just that they're comfortable with talk, they can afford it. Payment for involvement in the West is pathetic. £20 or €28 for a meeting at most. It is actually nearly impossible now, formally, to pay more. There are ways around it, but most research leads can't be bothered. They will pay a doctor's practice €3,000, but advisors the standard €28. If you want diversity in these spaces, people are giving up time in often low-paid jobs to do it. they have to be paid the same as everybody else. Oh, okay. This is because their knowledge is as valuable as everybody else's. That's the bottom line of academic injustice. An alternative narrative will not just come from academics. It will come from ordinary people, even those who are extraordinary. In other words, abnormal or mad. Finally, drugs, I will just say this. Li Shan talks about people living with Parkinsonism. What on earth does she mean by that? She means a new phenomenon that includes me. Some of us are now out there in the community rather than in institutions. Some of us lived through the transition. People are turning up to their doctors with strange symptoms, such as characterized Parkinson's disease. These turn out to be the long-term or tardive consequences of psychiatric drugs. Don't talk to people like me. Go work in the suburbs of Glasgow, the banlieues of Paris, downtown Chicago, to halfway houses, homeless people. People that have no recognition of their strange experiences, never mind support. They cannot make sense of them. I'll wrap up now. In some, Li Shan's work is a breakthrough. It's not a question of Singapore learning from the world, but of the world learning from Singapore in the shape of people like Li Shan. She has learned, and so have I. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diana, for that really, really wonderful and generous and thoughtful response to Li Shan's work. At this point, there's some questions in the chat, but Li Shan, I wanted to see whether you had wanted to follow up on any of the questions or comments that Diana made.
Sure. Yes, I really want to thank Dinah for her very kind and generous comments, and yeah. But let's go to the questions from the audience, being mindful of the time.
Okay, I think Yifeng Ku has put two questions up, and they write, given that mental health was declared as a national priority by the Prime Minister Lawrence Wong with all these mental health strategies. One question is, what is your assessment of the political appetite surrounding mental health? Do you consider these performative hollow acts? And secondary question, why it might be important to repoliticize Singapore's mental health scape? How do you see this happening within the next 5 years? These are very large questions, so I feel like you can choose which ones you want to address.
Li Shan, you know about Singapore?
Well, I sincerely believe that that these are not performative hollow acts. Oh, yeah. No, I really think that that there is genuine, sincere, well-intended people, good intentions. All that is true and it's real. And in so many discussions with fellow peers, we talk about structural challenges. We talk about how the issues might be systemic or structural rather than residing in individuals, with bad intentions. So to answer that question about hollow acts, I do not think they are. And then to answer the question about why it is important to repoliticize Singapore's mental health landscape and how might you see politicizing being done in Singapore within the next 5 years? Oh, okay. Thank you, Yifeng, for your question. Yeah, maybe I would say that um um that maybe that maybe the answer of why it's important to repoliticize may have to do with how depoliticized our environment is, if that makes sense, right? We we are in a situation where often it might seem that that the issues are cast as medical issues when they might be social issues, for example. The depoliticization also, I think, often makes it seem that when we talk about mental health or mental illness, that it's very focused on individuals. It's very focused on individuals being having problems, being impaired in some way, things like that. So I guess when the issues are broader, when the issues might have to do with environment, which may or may not be toxic, when the issues have to do with questions, bigger questions about policies on family, and the kind of support that's given to families, whether biological or non-biological, when so why is it important? I think I would say that it is important to repoliticize only because it is so depoliticized, and we can become more aware of the dynamics that's ongoing. Then yeah.
No, I was just going to say that's an excellent response because part of your presentation as well talks about the intersections of class and race that are not often, apparent in discussions about psychiatry. As far as I know, I'm not the expert, but from your presentation. We have another question from Jen Kwan, who writes, life writing workshops in Singapore tend to attract attendees who have direct or indirect experiences with mental health challenges. Some seek to explore and write about this within a workshop setting where safeguards vary. So Jen is interested in the state and usefulness of trauma-informed facilitation in these settings. How does this take shape? Is there any existing research on this?
So I'm glad to hear that there are many life writing workshops in Singapore. This is actually my field, and so I'm really glad to hear that. And trauma-informed facilitation in these settings, that makes it sound like these are mental health life writing workshops specifically. Is that correct? Or because I imagine that, sorry, just to clarify the question, life writing can generally refer to memoir, to biographies and autobiographies. And I'm just wondering, are these specifically mental health related life writing workshops, or general life writing workshops that may involve seniors that talking about making sense of their life, or young people, or what, like I'm not sure if I can really answer the question without understanding the nature of they tend to touch on
I think more
mental health.
general writing workshops is what Jen is saying, yes.
Right. I can't say I'm the expert on trauma-informed facilitation. That idea, I guess, maybe what I'm thinking you might be referring to is that idea of like childhood adversity, or like that there's this sort of thinking that that there's a general shape of how that story might be told based on such frameworks. So yeah, sorry,
No,
I'm not sure if this is a very good answer to your question, but
no, I think that does address. I mean, it is again a very I mean, the scope of your research is quite capacious. So I think people are coming at this from really different angles, which is great. And I wonder whether you'd like to, since there are no more questions coming up immediately in
I've
the
got
chat. Yes, Diana has a question.
trauma is all over the place in the West, and trauma can mean just about anything. Everything from a very famous woman, a woman who became very famous in France, called Madame Pellicot, who the most terrible, terrible things happened to to attach on the knee can be traumatic. What is trauma? How do you define it? There is no, it's so all-encompassing. Can mean anything and everything, therefore it means nothing in this research, in my view. And they want compassionate care. What's their example? Lack of coercion. What have we been arguing for 50 years or more? Get rid of coercion. I mean, it's just, age research. I wrote a paper on it it was published in Mad in America, and somebody told me off for using complicated language. But honestly, it makes no sense. The trauma with the capital T, as somebody once said to me, makes sense. But the way trauma is slung around these days, it just makes no sense at all. I mean, there is like for a friend of mine, there is a continuum between a slap on the knee and rape. No qualitative step, no, just a continuum between the two, a smooth straight line from one to the other. I just think it's totally ridiculous. Mad,
I
if you
think
like.
there are two more questions in the chat that I hope we can get to before we finish the session. One from Eliza Thomas, who says, "What do you aim to get out of this conversation? What practical steps do you want personally or us collectively to do to achieve this?" And then I'll as well just put into your view, Li Shan, the question from Minjia Tim, who writes, "Would love to hear more about what you mean by mad eye and what you think the role psychologists and peers can play in raising awareness and centering this perspective." So two sort of actually kind of related questions.
Okay, thank you. So so in relation to the first question about practical steps, I think I think there are really three things that I want to kind of quickly mention if there's time. First is really to encourage more discussions and to have us persons with lived experience to engage with each other, and also in this regard to tell our stories, that may or may not align with official or dominant narratives. I think in Singapore there's often a kind of casting medical workers as self-sacrificing superheroes. There's patients who are also like cast in terms of superheroes. Like for me, I feel that like humans are actually let's recognize how flawed we are. That we're capable of making mistakes and but also that we are capable of change and we are endless, right? And unfolding. So secondly, for those of us who are involved with publications and writing our stories, I just want to flag like a couple of things. One thing that came to bother me is like the endorsements that come with mental health writings by persons with lived experience. And it made me think that just as slave narratives need not be endorsed by white masters, perhaps that also means that our stories of lived experience may not or need not be always endorsed by medical professionals. And then in terms of the editing part of it, like there are many sort of anthologies these days where persons with lived experience write their stories and this is edited, and sometimes however well intentioned, this editing might unintentionally kind of erase what really the voice of the person. So so I would suggest and especially in research where first person sort of voice is not really encouraged, and also like the genre, I think. Yeah, so in terms of genre, that life writing is actually a very effective sort of genre in terms of like allowing for first person, allowing for a less neutral or objective kind of in quotes kind of perspectives to be shared. And then I guess the third thing would be in terms of practical steps would be I would certainly encourage my fellow peers to write and tell our stories that honor those who have come before us, listening to silences, connecting the past to the present, and reading and writing, engaging with other lives, and yeah, so through this, we then hopefully can begin to push for the idea of lived experience as being an equally legitimate and valuable form and source of knowledge.
Mm, thank you. I don't know whether you want to talk a little bit more about what Minjie was asking about in terms of what you mean by the mad eye. I think we can have about 4 or 5 minutes more of discussion so that we do have time to address that. I see as well there's a question from Helena Chu about the relation between social, emotional, and spiritual healings. But perhaps you would like to talk about the concept of the mad eye a little bit more to elaborate on what you talked about during your presentation.
Yeah, I'm looking at Mintie's question about the mad eye and psychologists and peers in raising awareness and centering this perspective. Okay. Yeah, so my talk, I would say, is squarely meant and intended for this talk in any case is intended for persons with lived experience. So I won't answer the part about like the psychologists. I this mad eye is something that I've been thinking about recently. I started actually thinking about it in terms of the ear, like what does it mean to listen with different ears? But uh then well, because I family who has like some visual sort of issues, so it made me start to think about eyes, and then from there I kind of was playing around with the idea of visionary, what it means, and then yeah, and also maybe more metaphorically the unreasonableness of what that mad eye might look at. And then yeah, so yeah, something like that.
No, I really think that's great. And I think in some senses, you're also talking about the reversal of the gaze, who's
Yeah,
who's
yeah.
looking, right? And who's
Mm.
being monitored or surveilled, and then you're looking back, right, to kind of reverse that. So that's really powerful. There's a question from Kai as well. Would love to know your understanding of how persons with lived experiences in other jurisdictions are empowered to participate in mental health legislation, especially as more contentious themes like unnamed medical assisted death are coming up.
Other jurisdictions?
Other jurisdictions, yes. Li Shan,
Hmm.
Well, supposedly in the UK, there was a lot of consultation with the lead to a particular report about the mental health act, the new mental health act, which hasn't happened. Um, but if you drill down to those consultations, you needed to be able to get somewhere quickly without a train ticket paid for in advance. You needed to be able to get to London or Manchester, the big cities. Only certain people could actually make it. And in particular, people on benefits just could not make it. People living on welfare benefits just could not go. So once again, it was a certain type of person, although this was never said, that just had the capacity, the material capacity to attend those advisory meetings. It's ever present. It just reproduces itself again and again, and it's got to be broken.
Li Shan, anything
Yeah,
to add there?
yeah, I think just wanting to ask a little bit more about this question, and also because the question is about how persons with lived experience are empowered. Who is empowering them? I mean, is it self-empowerment, or is
Victimizing.
it so I'm curious as to, like, yeah, if it's self-empowerment, I think there really is a lot going on. Whereas like empowered by systems, empowered by And then it's also very specific because it's talking about legislation specifically rather than other kinds of mental health policies and things. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that,
So
yeah, I mean, it is
um,
again, like there are these amazing questions coming in, but they're also very, very large. And I mean, don't feel obligated that you have to like obviously reply, respond to all of them. Thank you everyone for your questions, and thank you to Li Shan and Diana as well for responding so thoughtfully to it. I mean, I think Li Shan, your presentation and your work just opens up so many avenues that, to think about the intersections of the personal, the intimate, the lived experience, and also these larger sort of structures of power surrounding how we think of psychiatry, and its damages in our society, and especially in Singapore. So with that, I think you have some accolades in the chat there about people learning from your experience, but I think with that we'll close. We're at 5:05 p.m. here in Singapore. Thank you so much for everyone for coming to participate and to listen to the seminar. Just ask Li Shan and Diana to stay around, but thank you everyone. Please enjoy your Sunday, and we hope to see you for our next session as well.
Okay.
thank you.
Do we leave